This is notes 4, page 2. Here we're going to look at patterns, shortcuts for squaring a binomial. It's so important that you develop language to recognize and name what you're seeing when you look at a problem. So it's important that you look at this. That's two terms and I'm squaring it. This is the square of a binomial. And there is a pattern to how the square of a binomial always turns out. Right now we don't know the pattern, so we're going to go by the definition of a square. What does it mean to square something? Multiply that same thing times itself. So it would be 2x plus 3 times 2x plus 3. Both of them are pluses, no change of signs. Same thing times itself. When we write it out like that, we realize it's a FOIL problem. First times the first is 4x squared. Outer is plus 6x. Inner is plus 6x. Notice how they're both 6x's, so you got 6x twice. And then last times the last is plus 9. And so we have 4x squared plus 12x plus 9. Now, there is a pattern in this answer, and that's the pattern we're going to try to write down. So notice the 4x squared, wasn't that just the square of 2x? So it's the square of the first term. Okay. Notice the 9, well, that's just 3 squared. Now, the second term's not always the 3, so think in general terms, it's the square of the second term. Now, the middle term is the most complicated. It's outer plus inner. But notice outer and inner were the same, so it's like you were doubling 6x. And notice you could just think 2x times 3, multiply the two terms together and double it. So, multiply the two terms and double it. And then with signs, they're all positive because everything in the problem is positive, okay? Now, let's try 2x minus 3 quantity squared. Notice how the numbers are the same, but the only difference is the sign. So let's see what happens when we just put a negative sign in the middle. So again, to square something, it means to multiply the exact same thing by itself. So it's 2x minus 3 times 2x minus 3. Don't go changing any signs. And again, sort of backing up a little bit, the problem we have at hand is the square of a binomial. So, and that's what we're looking for, shortcuts to the square of a binomial. When you write it out, you see it's a FOIL problem. So first times the first is 4x squared. This time outer is minus 6x. Then the inner product is also minus 6x. So the outer and the inner, they're the same sign. So they're both losses. So those losses do double, okay? But notice last times the last is a positive 9 because it's a negative times a negative. And then again, the outer plus the inner are like terms, so you combine them to negative 12x plus 9. And again, notice the pattern. Oh, the 4x squared, well, that's just take that first term and square it. The 9, let's just take that negative 3. Well, negative 3 squared, or actually, I wouldn't even think of it that way. Just take the 3. Just square the last term. And then again, that middle term is like taking 2x times a 3, 6x doubling it. Or you could think 2x times negative 3, because that's going to produce the negative there. But number-wise, it's just multiply the two terms, double it, and watch your signs. Okay, so notice the only difference in the two answers is the sign of the middle term. So when there's a negative separating your two terms in the square of the binomial, your middle term will be negative, but all the other terms are positive. Okay, so this is going to happen every time. So we write out this pattern. And then this question here is the language. I really can't overemphasize how important it is for you to have the language to identify the problem. So the problem that we have is the square of a binomial. And every time you see the square of a binomial, you're really going to have two ways to multiply it out. You can use the slow way, which is FOIL, we just did it, or use the pattern, which we're about to get. Okay? And really one of the most common mistakes is students don't recognize or say to themselves, oh, this is the square of a binomial, because generally in class when I say, how do you square a binomial? Students will tell me, FOIL or use the pattern. But then they mess it up on the homework, and I think it's because they're not talking to themselves. Hey, I'm looking at the square of a binomial. So try to practice that language yourself. So here are the patterns for the square of a binomial. Two terms in parentheses squared. So here are both patterns at the same time because they're almost identical. A plus b quantity squared is a squared plus 2ab plus b squared. A minus b quantity squared is a squared minus 2ab plus b squared. So notice in the answer, the only difference is the sign of the middle term. Notice in the problem, the difference is the sign between the two terms inside the parentheses. Now, the way I just read that, if that's the only way you say these patterns, you probably won't be able to use them when it comes time to. So, notice, so let's get some language for what's going on with these patterns. First of all, you really need to notice how A's and B's are in the answer. Well, how does that relate to the problem? Notice A is whatever the first term is. So this is really saying, A squared is really saying, whatever that first term is, you square it. The whole thing. Watch those coefficients. Now, there are B's in the answer. And notice how B is simply the second term in your binomial. And I'm going to jump over here. The last term of your answer is always b squared. Well, what does that mean? Well, it's always square the second term. Be mindful that the last term is always positive, because it's either coming from a positive times a positive or it's coming from a negative times a negative. So the last term is always positive. It's the middle term that's a little bit more complicated to say. What we see is A times B. Well, A and B are the two terms, so multiply the two terms, then times 2, which is doubling. And that's exactly what we saw happening up here. We saw 2x times 3, 6x, but it got doubled. So, for the middle term, you multiply the two terms together, then double, which by the way means multiply by 2. Okay, and then watch your signs. The signs are built into the pattern. Okay, so if the binomial has a plus in the middle term's positive. If the binomial has a negative in the middle term's negative. And for your doubting Thomases, how do we get these patterns? Well, if you just take a plus b quantity squared and you FOIL it, you get a squared plus 2ab plus b squared. And if you take a minus b quantity squared and you FOIL it, you get a squared minus 2ab plus b squared. It happens every time. So if you can learn the shortcut, it is a great time-saving device. It's even a greater time-saving device when we start factoring problems like this. So let's look at this problem. Recognize what it is. Name this animal. This is the square of a binomial. Okay? And you have a choice. You could write this out twice and FOIL it, or you could use the pattern. And I really won't care which way you do it, as long as you do it correctly. However, I want to encourage you to learn the patterns because they really make you more efficient, will make your homework go faster. So, to get this answer, I need to square the entire first term. Now be careful here. You have to square the entire first term, which means you have to square the 8 and the x because that is a product. So that is 64x squared. Okay, now here's what I do for the middle term as a visual, and I suggest you do this until you get really good at it. Scoop the two terms together, multiply them. Oh, that's 24x, right? 8x times 3, multiply the two terms together, then double it. That is multiply by 2, so that's going to be plus 48x. And then finally, plus square the last term, which is 9. Okay, now I think I have just enough room to show you that if I FOILed this, I will get exactly this answer. So let me see if I can squeeze this in here. So 8x plus 3 times 8x plus 3. First times the first is 64x squared. Outer, notice how that's 8x times 3 is plus 24x. Inner, notice how that's 8x times 3. Did I say 8x plus 3 the other time? It's 8x times 3, which is another 24x. And then 3 times 3 is 9. And then if I add the 24x's, I get the 48x. So either way, you'll get the right answer, but I really do encourage you to learn this pattern because it's going to be really, really helpful at times, and especially when we're factoring.